I'm Bob at I Like to Make Stuff. Today we're gonna make this room look way better by nailing down some hardwood floor. In the last video in the home series, I showed you how we updated the bonus room upstairs, and in that room we put down some floating hardwood floor. Down here in the main level of the house, we're gonna nail down the hardwood floor because it needs to transition from room to room, and that product was just too expensive to do at this scale. We're gonna start doing that floor here in the bedroom. It's a pretty basic shape, so I thought it would be a good way to get started. Before you actually do any work, you have to prep the surface that you're gonna be working on, so it needs to be perfectly flat and clean. But when you take up carpet, there's more than just pulling up the top layer. There's a layer of foam underneath it that's held down by a whole bunch of staples, way more staples than anybody should ever use, and you have to pull each one of those. You can pull those out with a staple removal tool or just put a flathead screwdriver under each one of them and pry it up. But it's really important that you get every single staple out of the floor. If you have any nails that have backed out of the subfloor at all, just hammer them flat as well. The other thing that you have to take up that's actually a little bit more painful to deal with is the tack strip that goes all the way around the edge of the room. This is a small wooden strip with very sharp tacks sticking up out of it that go into the bottom of the carpet. The best way I've found to take these up is to take a pry bar, put it right up next to where a nail is going into the floor, give it one good hit with a hammer, and it'll separate it from the floor just a little bit. Don't try to pry it out at that point, just move on to the next nail, and by the time you pop all of the nails up, the strip will come out. If you try to pry one nail up by itself, the wood on the strip will break and then it'll just be harder to deal with overall. And once you get these things out, they are extremely sharp and extremely nasty. So another tip is to take some of that foam that you pulled out earlier and put all of these strips on top of that foam. Once you've got all of them on there, just wrap the foam up around it to make it easier to carry and throw the whole thing in the trash can. After you get all that stuff removed, you gotta go around and sweep and vacuum the floor and get it completely clean and completely smooth. Most likely you probably missed some staples, so be sure to go back and get those before you move on. Speaking of moving on, the next step is to lay down the underlayment. The underlayment is a roll of paper that's a moisture barrier, and you wanna lay it down on the entire surface and make sure that every row that you make is overlapped by at least 4 inches. This brand in particular actually has a line here to show you where to overlap it. All you gotta do is start in one corner, roll it all the way to the opposite end, and cut it off with a utility knife. Then go back with a staple gun and put in a few staples just to keep it in place. After you get one row finished, just move on to the next row and staple it down as well until you get the entire room covered. Make sure that you get it all the way to the walls, make it go through the doorways, and cut out any air vents that you have in the floor. When you lay down hardwood flooring, you need to leave at least 3/8 of an inch gap here for expansion of the wood. If you want to, you can take up this piece of trim and use the gap underneath it as the expansion gap. But in my case, I have an entire home to do, so I'm gonna leave this trim in place, put down the floor, leaving the gap right here, and then add some quarter round on top to cover the gap. Eventually you'll probably be able to just eyeball the gap, but I measured off 3/8 of an inch from the baseboard and then used a chalk line to snap a line as a reference. I laid my first pieces at that line, drilled some holes in the face, and drove in some finishing nails to hold them down to the subfloor. I used a nail set to drive those nail heads down below the surface and then came back later and filled in the holes with wood filler. For the next layer or two, set them in place, drill through the tongue and drive in another nail and sink it below the surface. Eventually you'll get to a point to where a pneumatic nailer can fit against the wall, and then it goes a lot faster. At the end of each row, you'll have to cut the last piece down to make sure that it fits, leaving the 3/8 of an inch gap as well, except in cases like this where you're butting into another surface. I put a cross piece underneath the doors to use as a transition between the rooms. Eventually you'll get so far along that you're too close to the wall and you don't have enough room to swing the hammer. That's when you gotta go back to the process of drilling through the tongue of the pieces and hammering in the nails by hand. It definitely slows down at this point a little bit, but you should only have a couple more rows to do, so it shouldn't take too long. And just like at the beginning of the room, the final row you have to drill in through the face of the board and drive nails straight in. There's also a pretty good chance that you're gonna have to rip all of the pieces in the final row on the table saw to make them the right width. And when you do that, don't forget to leave the expansion gap on this side as well. And in my case, the last row of this room is actually also gonna transition into a door, so I'm just gonna add another piece here to fit underneath the door as it closes. Once you've got all the floor laid down, the final touch is to add quarter round. Get your quarter round in place, hold it tight down to the floor, and then shoot brad nails through the quarter round into the baseboard, not into the floor. This gives it a really finished look and hides the expansion gap around all of the edges of the room. And that's how you nail down hardwood flooring. You can totally do it. It's a lot of work, but it's not hard. And putting down hardwood makes rooms look really nice and it adds value to the home. And if you get solid wood like I did, you can refinish them over time so they last really long. There's a few things to think about if you're gonna put hardwood into your house. One, you have to make sure you get enough square footage plus at least 10% for waste. You also have to let the wood acclimate in the space that it's actually gonna go into for about 7 days. That number changes a little bit depending on the species, but whoever you buy your flooring from should be able to give you some insight there. I'm extremely happy with how these floors turned out and how they look in our home. And we've got some other plans for some patterns to do in other rooms. We'll probably have videos on that as well. That's about it for this one. Don't forget to check out the other videos in my home series. Plus, I've got a bunch of other projects that are not home related that you might be interested in as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the main channel and the second channel for some behind the scenes stuff. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.